Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hey everybody, welcome to Unbound Off Script. You just heard a sample of a possible new intro that we might be using for season 3. There's a backstory behind it, but I won't get into that until we decide if we're going to use it or not. And you'll hear the possible new outro at the end of this episode as well. Let me know what you think if you feel like it. Today, I wanted to talk about something that's kind of been on my mind a lot as I've been working through the material for season 3. Which, if you've been following along, you know is called The Other Side of Quiet. And it deals heavily with my teenage years and the trauma I experienced during that time. But before we get into all of that and the season itself, an early theme in that book is childhood development and how it affects our older years. Like as we get older, it affects our teen years and our adult years and relationships that we form. So today, I wanted to talk specifically about something called rupture and repair. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. Here's the interesting thing. In my family, we were actually taught this concept and practiced it. My parents understood rupture and repair before it became a therapy buzzword. They modeled it. They talked about it. They kind of made it part of how our family functioned, which I think is great. And I did that too in my own family. But yet, despite having that foundation, I should have struggled with rupture and repair after trauma. In general, though, I don't struggle with adult relationships simply because I've learned to set boundaries and I have the ability to walk away when those boundaries are disrespected. And that, to me, is not struggle at all. It doesn't necessarily fall into the whole category of rupture and repair. Boundaries are like a whole different kind of thing. But anyway, I've learned that for some, knowing about rupture and repair intellectually doesn't automatically protect you from the effects of trauma that happen outside your family system. So I just want to talk about what rupture and repair actually is and why it matters so much, and how it shows up in every single relationship that you have, whether you realize it or not. So rupture and repair is a concept that comes from attachment theory and developmental psychology. At its most basic, here's what it means. So rupture is when connection between two people breaks. Okay, it's a disconnect, a misunderstanding, a fight, a moment when someone feels hurt or unseen, just misunderstood, or even abandoned by someone they're connected to for any number of reasons. And then repair is what happens after that rupture. It's the reconnection, the apology, the acknowledgement, the conversation, the return to safety and trust, right? But the crucial part that most people miss is ruptures are inevitable. Okay, they're going to happen in every relationship you have with your parents, with your partners, your friends, your children, your coworkers, with everyone. And the goal is not to avoid ruptures at all, because they're going to happen. The goal is to repair them. So Dr. Edward Tronick is a developmental psychologist. He did groundbreaking research on this with infants. He found that healthy mother-infant pairs experience ruptures, moments of disconnect constantly, like multiple times per hour even. The baby looks away, the mother misreads a cue, the baby might get fussy, mom might try 3 different things before figuring out what's wrong, right? And these are all tiny ruptures, and they're important. But healthy pairs also repair constantly. The mother notices the baby's distress and responds, and the baby reconnects. And the cycle of disconnect and reconnect happens over and over and over, like hundreds of times a day. And this is how babies learn that relationships are safe. Not because they never experience disconnection, but because they learn that disconnection can be followed by reconnection and the ruptures can be repaired. They learn when things go wrong between us, we can fix it. When I'm upset, someone will notice and respond. When we disconnect, we come back together. And that becomes the template for every relationship that they have for the rest of their lives. Now, here's where it gets complicated. When ruptures happen, but repair does not. So when a child experiences disconnection, but no one comes back to reconnect, something different gets encoded in their nervous system. They learn when things go wrong, they stay wrong. When I'm upset, no one notices or cares. When we disconnect, we stay disconnected. And that becomes their template instead. And it doesn't have to be dramatic neglect or abuse for this to happen at all. It can be as simple as a parent who doesn't know how to apologize. A parent who gets defensive instead of acknowledging their child's hurt. Or a parent who believes that admitting they were wrong undermines their authority. The types of parents who have an ego so big, they just think, well, I'm the adult, so I'm always right, and you're always wrong, and whatever. And that is just so unhealthy. It can be a parent who's so overwhelmed by their own stuff that they can't attune to their child's emotional needs consistently, right? So here's what's important to understand. Kids don't have the cognitive capacity to think, oh, my parent is just stressed right now. This isn't about me. Kids don't do that. They just experience the rupture and the absence of repair. And their nervous system kind of files that away as this is how relationships work. When there's conflict, there's no resolution. When there's hurt, there's no healing, right? Research has shown that repeated ruptures without repair literally can change how a child's brain develops. And it affects their ability to regulate their emotions as well and trust others and form more secure attachments later in life, right? So they develop what's called an insecure attachment style, which is pretty much just a fancy way of saying they learned that relationships aren't consistently safe or reliable. And then they carry that into every relationship that they have as adults. There's another version of this that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, in my opinion. Some families don't just struggle with repair. They don't allow rupture at all. And these families, where everything is supposed to be calm and pleasant and controlled, and there's no fighting, and there's no raised voices, and there's no conflict, and there's no mess, and there's no fuss. On the surface, it can look healthy, peaceful even, but what's actually happening is that rupture is being avoided or suppressed or denied altogether. In these families, disagreement of any kind feels dangerous. Anger feels unacceptable. Hurt feelings are minimized or reframed as overreactions. The unspoken rule basically is, we don't do conflict here. So children growing up in these environments don't learn rupture and repair because there's nothing to repair. They learn something else instead. They learn that connection depends on keeping things smooth all day, every day, 24/7. That love is conditional on harmony. That expressing frustration, anger, or disappointment risks destabilizing the entire system, right? And because of that, they never get to see what healthy conflict looks like. They never see two people disagree and then come back together. They never see raised emotions settle, accountability happen, or trust deepen after a rupture. So they grow up without a template for conflict at all. And then they enter adult relationships. And then conflict happens. Because of course it does. Because conflict is normal. It's inevitable. It's actually a sign of intimacy and differentiation, two real people showing up honestly. But to someone who's never had rupture modeled, that conflict feels catastrophic. A fight doesn't feel like a moment to work through. It feels like evidence that the relationship is broken or unhealthy or defective or too hard. They might think this shouldn't be this way. If we were really compatible, we wouldn't fight. Something must be wrong. They might run off from conflict instead of dealing with it and repairing it and just wait and hope that it'll blow over. This is all very, very unhealthy. So instead of leaning into repair, they panic. They withdraw, they shut down, they emotionally exit, or they leave the relationship entirely. Not because the relationship is unhealthy, but because they don't know how to exist inside healthy conflict. To them, rupture itself feels like failure. But the truth is, a relationship without rupture isn't healthy. It's just untested. Healthy relationships aren't defined by the absence of conflict. They're defined by the ability to move through conflict. And if you've never learned that growing up, if conflict was avoided, minimized, or seen as dangerous even, then adulthood can feel brutal when disagreements inevitably show up. That's not a personal failing. It's that missing model that kids need. So here's where my story kind of gets complicated. I grew up in a family that understood rupture and repair. My parents taught us about it. When there were arguments or hurt feelings, we talked about them. Apologies were given. Reconnection happened. I had a template for healthy repair. But I still developed an insecure attachment style. I still struggled back then with trusting that people will stay or that conflicts can be resolved and ruptures can be repaired, because the ruptures that damaged me most didn't happen in my family system. They happened with peers who bullied me, or with a boyfriend who abused me, with situations where there was profound rupture and zero possibility of repair because the other person wasn't safe, or they weren't capable, or, they just weren't interested in reconnecting. And unlike families where conflict is avoided altogether, these ruptures weren't hidden or denied. They were relentless and unresolved. When you experience rupture after rupture after rupture and there's no repair, so when someone hurts you and then hurts you again and again, and there's no acknowledgement and no apology and no reconnection, your nervous system starts to override what you learned in your family. It starts to believe, okay, I know repair is supposed to happen. I've seen it happen, but it's not happening here. And if it's not happening here, maybe it won't happen anywhere. Trauma teaches you that ruptures are permanent, that once connection breaks, it stays broken, that people who hurt you won't come back to make it right. And even if you intellectually know that's not true, even if you grew up seeing repair modeled by your parents, the traumatized part of your nervous system does not give a shit about that intellectual knowledge. It just knows I've been hurt, no one fixed it, and I'm not safe. And that sadly becomes the louder message. So how does this play out in adult relationships? Because this is where it gets really practical. Some people come into adulthood bracing for conflict because they've lived through unrepaired rupture. Others come in unprepared for conflict at all because it was never allowed in the first place. And both groups struggle, but in very different ways. So if you grew up with consistent repair, you likely approach conflict in relationships with a certain amount of confidence. You know that disagreements don't mean the end of the relationship. You know that hurt feelings can be acknowledged and worked through, and you trust that the other person will come back to the table. But if you grew up with inconsistent repair or no repair, you might be hypervigilant for signs that the other person is pulling away, and you might interpret normal disagreements as catastrophic threats to the relationship. You might get very uncomfortable or retreat. When a voice is raised, you may misinterpret healthy rupture as abuse. And if you grew up in a home where rupture itself wasn't allowed, conflict might feel like proof that the relationship is wrong rather than an invitation to repair. So some real world examples of how this might show up. The person who ghosts at the first sign of conflict. They get into an argument with a friend or a partner, and instead of working through it, they disappear. Bye. For some reason, this comes from trauma, ruptures that were never repaired. For others, it comes from never having seen conflict handled at all. So either way, the nervous system is telling them, this is permanent, get the fuck out. Another example, the person who can't let anything go. They escalate small disagreements. Are the ones that need immediate resolution. They're terrified of anything being left unresolved. And this often comes from living with unrepaired ruptures as well, where nothing ever got fixed. There's the person who apologizes for everything. They overfunction in conflict. They take responsibility for everything because somewhere along the way, they learned that connection depends on them keeping things smooth. There's also the person who never apologizes. They get defensive, they deflect, they avoid accountability. Sometimes repair, or sometimes because repair was never modeled, or sometimes because rupture was punished. In those families where they didn't want it, they wanted quiet in the house and, couldn't do anything. And then there's the person who pushes people away when they get close. They create distance right when intimacy deepens, because whether conflict was traumatic or forbidden, their nervous system learned that connection leads to danger. And that can happen too in people who've been super burned by people in past relationships and stuff. They refuse to get close to people because they're just convinced, well, that person told me they loved me too, and they left me. So how am I supposed to believe that you love me and you're not going to leave me? I've actually seen this very recently. And yeah, got to work on that with your partner if your partner is afraid. So yeah, those are like 5 examples. I think it was 5 examples. Do you see yourself in any of these? Does this happen? So what I want you to know, even if you didn't learn healthy rupture and repair as a child, you can learn it now. Even if conflict was terrifying, or if it was forbidden, or if it was never repaired, your nervous system is not permanently broken. Attachment styles can shift, patterns can change, but it does require a few things. First thing is like that awareness. You want to notice what conflict feels like in your body. Does it feel like panic or shame or urgency? Does it give you an urge to flee? That reaction kind of tells a story. You also need safe people to practice with. You need relationships where conflict isn't avoided and it isn't weaponized, where rupture is allowed and repair is possible. So this is my own personal experience that I just made reference to a couple minutes ago. Done that, helping this person along. The willingness to stay in discomfort. That's a big thing too. Repair requires staying present when every instinct says to leave or shut down. That discomfort is the work. You need to be willing to sit there and be uncomfortable. It's not forever. And also practice. You're going to mess it up. That's what everyone who learns does. That's not failure. You're learning, right? Research by Dr. Sue Johnson shows that couples who can repair after conflict have stronger relationships than couples who avoid conflict altogether, because repair builds trust. It's not that it's building perfection. It builds trust. I think a lot about how different my life might have been if the ruptures I experienced in my teen years had been followed by repair. I also think about how confusing adulthood can be for people who never saw rupture at all. They're different paths, but the pain is similar. And, I can't control whether other people repair ruptures with me, but I can choose how I show up now. And I think that's where the work is, right? If you're listening to this and you're recognizing your own patterns around rupture and repair, you're not broken. You're just responding to what you learned or what you didn't get to see. But now you can learn something different, and you should. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Oh, by the way, I'm doing a giveaway for an Amazon gift card. And all you have to do is look at the show notes, the show notes, for the info. And the password is donkey. Don't post that anywhere, though. Donkey. That's proof you've heard the show and you've earned your entry. Bonus entries are available too. Just check the contest info in the show notes. The info's there. It's easy. No biggie. Donkey. My podcast will always be free, but if you want to support production costs so I can make the show even better down the road, all support and contact info is in the show notes. And you can join the Facebook group to continue the conversation. If you're not there already, I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author-bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.